Hey, welcome to the 10 Minutes for Democracy stream for this week. We're just starting out, so as usual, I'm gonna start out with some channel update stuff. I got a whole new setup here. I'm trying something a little bit different. I got monitors on both sides. I'm sitting at my desk. Hope that'll be a little more comfortable. I can kind of maybe stream a little longer. We'll see. We're coming up today, as I said, I start with the channel update. Then I got some stuff about some news stories about AOC that I thought were kind of interesting and worth kind of looking into the way kind of insider politics kind of work and how she's kind of trying to navigate that and what she's running into there. There's some news about Senate reconciliation and how that's going to affect this potential bill for, the bill for, what's that bill for? That's the bill for the infrastructure bill. Wow, I cannot remember that. And related to that, Joe Manchin's back in the news. They're always asking him questions and he's saying stuff. I don't know how much it was gaslighting, how much it's serious about, but it could affect Joe Biden's infrastructure bill and some of the other bills that Democrats are trying to run on and trying to brand themselves as, and he's kind of getting in the way. So we'll have to see if he really keeps up and keeps doing that. I got this new mic here too, so you'll see this in the corner here. I hope I'm not too loud. This mic is a little more sensitive. I think that I was using a boom mic before. It's a little different. Anyway, after that, I'll move on to the Georgia law. That's fair amount of voter suppression. Democrats have branded it kind of the new Jim Crow. I'll talk about that a little bit and about kind of Stacey Abrams and how she interjected herself into that whole situation. I got an update about Move to Amend. Our bill was finally, the organization I'm involved in, that bill was finally, I forgot to put comments up. That bill was finally was finally introduced into the current Congress. Had to wait for all the bills in front of it to get introduced, but it's finally introduced. I have good news about that, besides what I just told you. And then I'll probably do a little update of the George Floyd trial and what that's, and what my kind of feelings about that now that we're a week into it. Okay, so we'll start with, if you're here on a rewatch, if you're not on YouTube, go to YouTube and watch it because I have chapters there. You can jump to whatever section. I'm going to look through the whole thing and break it up by the different stories I'm doing. So you can jump to the story that you're interested in. And it's a much better experience. Facebook, I can't do that. Or I don't know how to do that. I don't know which, hence I don't know. But if you're interested, maybe try to do that. See how that works for you. And of course, if you don't usually watch on Facebook, on YouTube, and you go there, consider liking and subscribing to help me push this out. All right. So first thing, channel update. So as I was talking about before, I got a new setup here. I'm trying, the audio might be a little bit louder because I got this new directional mic here. Get the little pop filter in front of it. I'm using it more so. I might do some voiceover videos. It's more so for that. It's very high quality audio. It seemed like a good thing to use. Using the same camera, I was going to try to use a webcam, but it's worse quality and I can't control the zoom without using OBS and a bunch of complicated stuff. I didn't want to run into that this time around. So I said, you know what, let me just set up a tripod. I remove the monitors, my desk in front of me. Remove the monitor, set the camera up, just point right at me. I can zoom it. Still got my green screen in the background, so I still got 10 Minutes of Democracy back there. I meant to adjust this a little bit for other viewers for this particular stream so that it would have a different branding on it, but I don't know if I'm going to do that or not. I don't want to talk about. So I have a new video I just released yesterday. It's a YouTube short, so it's under a minute. And what I do is I just recite a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. about right to work. Now, I thought right to work laws were some new conservative innovation to try to undermine unions. Apparently, it already existed in the early 1960s. And MLK had a quote about it, which I actually saw on a Instagram post from Bernie Sanders. I said, wow, that's really cool. Looked at it online, kind of confirmed it. I saw a little piece he took out that was about kind of segregation that wasn't as relevant nowadays. And just recited it and put it up there. I thought it's useful. I might do that some more because there are a lot of great quotes out there, especially from MLK, who was very involved in workers' rights. People don't know that about Martin Luther King. He was big into that. And in fact, where he got assassinated was actually in Memphis. He was there supporting a strike is a protest, or I think it was a strike. It was a protest or a strike, but it was a labor dispute that he wasn't getting involved in. So people know that about him, but he was about he was anti-war. He was about a lot of things besides, black and white people getting along nice. Okay. I also recorded, but I've not released yet, a video about cancel culture that will probably come out tomorrow or the next day. I talk about kind of some of the things I think are sometimes called cancel culture, but I think are perfectly valid. I then kind of turn it and kind of pivot it towards my stuff, what I do as far as here at 10 Minutes for Democracy. And so I really like making it. I was very happy with it. I've edited it already. I was very happy with it. So I hope that eventually comes out and people enjoy it. Also, so my metrics, interesting. So I'm now, I started a Twitter feed. I'm only focused on Twitter. I look at it maybe once every 2 days and scroll through it a bit, see what's popping, see what people are talking about. But I actually have 9 followers now. It's not that many. I know 2 or 3 of them personally. But it's slowly, getting a few more up there. I have the Twitter link down over here. When I do go to it, I mostly follow like journalists, people that I think are interesting, thought leaders, and progressive politicians, and just people I think that are saying interesting stuff that I might not see anywhere else and reflect kind of politically what's going on. So yeah, journalists and politicians mostly, and I retweet things I agree with or that I think are interesting and people might want to hear about. So haven't heard anything bad yet. So, but I don't do it a ton. It's mostly for posting my videos. So if you're on Twitter a lot, it's a place where you can receive updates, because some people don't, go to YouTube a lot for videos. They might go, but they might scroll Twitter a lot. So I'm trying to be present on other media. I'm on Instagram as myself, but I don't post that because it's really more for my friends and people that know me. But that's something that's there as well. And also interesting, last note before I move on to the first story, which is that I got 2 new subs today, which I thought was interesting. It's been pretty dry. I've been trying to switch more to streaming, and that hasn't gone that well. And but I've still been releasing at least 1 video a week, but it just hasn't been catching on. I haven't been getting ones that get a lot of new views from people who haven't seen me before. So I think my subs are the ones watching them, which I appreciate, but I'm trying to expand my audience, and that's not helping with that. So I'm trying, but then today I got 2 new ones, so that was cool. All right, so we're gonna go on to the first story. So a story came out about how ineffective AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was as a legislator. Now, this is a story out of the New York Post, I believe. And although it's a study, it was done by College University, but it was reported by the New York Post, who talk about stuff related to New York a whole lot. And the metric they used to determine that she was ineffective was whether or not the 21 bills that she presented in the last Congress whether or not they got any whether or not the committees got any action on them, and whether or not there were any floor votes, and whether or not any of them became law. And she ranked very low using those metrics. Now, one thing they pointed out, and again, it's New York Post, they try to kind of make it dramatic, is that someone like Ilhan Omar, who's also progressive and to me arguably further to the left than AOC, actually ranked better because one of her bills apparently became law. That actually surprises me because that was the last 2 years of the Trump administration. And I'm kind of wondering what bill was able to actually get through Congress and be signed by Trump that's, that would represent, some kind of impressive, progressive legislation. It seems to me like you're mostly just holding water at that point when the opposing party still controls the Senate at that point and controls the presidency. So the Ilhan got one passed. I think that's great. But this metric actually, to me, seems to reflect more so her own party's perhaps shunning of AOC and attempts to kind of marginalize her. I mean, you look at somebody like Ilhan Omar, you would think that they would have a bigger problem with her in terms of she's, to me, on some issues, like, say, Israel, even more outspoken than AOC is. But AOC is the one, getting absolutely no traction with her bills. And one of those bills, I believe, was Medicare for All, which she introduced and had 128 co-sponsors. Now, their metric for determining she was ineffective didn't include that, which I thought was very interesting because, to me, introducing a bill that has 128 co-sponsors seems like something pretty effective and important. And actually, the fact that bill existed actually galvanized people who wanted her and other progressives to try to force Nancy Pelosi to allow a floor vote on it. Well, floor vote on what? If she hadn't introduced it in Congress before, there wouldn't even be a bill to force a vote on. So I think that they're not giving her enough credit for that, as well as for the fact that she also has, and this is the thing that's gotten people mad at her and caused, I think, her to somewhat get marginalized. She doesn't allow for, she doesn't pay dues to the DCCC. She raises her own money and she distributes her own money where she wants to distribute it. And actually, the next story is about some shenanigans that went on with that. There was more so the DCCC's mistake, more so than hers, but was still interesting. Anyway, she raises that money. She raises a lot of money for progressive candidates and really any candidate that is willing to accept her money. She endorses candidates. She's very popular and she endorses candidates. She doesn't do enough of that. And I have another video where I talk about what she can do. And that's more so favoring, progressive candidates, even if there's a Democratic incumbent, which she's reticent to do. But I think she should do. But she has done that sometimes. And I think that's important and that's useful. So, for me, looking at this story, I found it to be something that was, to me, a reflection, if anything, of her rebel status. Even though this next story, she's not quite as much a rebel as we might think. So the next story is a controversy regarding donations. So as I said, AOC gives a lot of money to a lot of candidates. She did so in the 2020 cycle, and she's doing so for the 2022 congressional cycle as well. Because, every congressperson has to run for election every 2 years. And so that costs a lot of money. She raises a lot of small money donations. And so what she does is she gives a lot of money to a lot of Democratic candidates. Pretty much she puts out a communique, whatever you want to call it, and says, whoever wants me to donate to you, I'll do so. She's basically trying to engender support that way. And so this time around, she was doing that, and she passed out $160,000 and $5,000 portions to various candidates. And 3 candidates in particular, who are conservative Democrats, got upset with her. And the reason why is because they didn't get any heads up ahead of time that she was going to do it. Now, what happened is the DCCC says that they gave out wire information for those candidates without asking the candidates if they wanted it. And so it's not clear at this point whether or not, AOC presumed, or her aides, she didn't do all this herself, obviously, presumed that they wanted, by the fact that they got the wire information, that they wanted the money, or if they were actually told that. But the point is, the DCCC is the one that gave AOC's aides the information that allowed them to then wire the money. Now the money is in the accounts, even if those 3 conservative Democrats, and there may be others that are mad too. Some were openly happy about it. Beside those 3 that are upset, that were willing to go on the record, their campaigns were willing to go on the record that they were unhappy. But for them and anybody else, at this point, even if they give the money back, it'll still probably be on the FEC disclosure. And they'll say, the Republicans will say that we're socialists and AOC is in charge of us and pulling our strings, and so we're in trouble. And in the article in Politico, which is itself kind of an establishment publication, they put in a quote where someone else said, they can lie about you anyway. They can tell stories about you, even if you have nothing to do with AOC. So why don't you just take the money? I didn't say, why don't you take the money? But that's my point. Why don't you just take the money? If they want to lie on you, they can. The only difference is whether or not you have a good retort or not. And if you give the money back, you still have a good retort. So, to me, it's up to them what they want to do. But I thought that was very interesting. Part of it was interesting to me because I'm wondering why AOC isn't being more selective about who she gives money to. I don't know if she's trying to circumvent Nancy Pelosi and the establishment and establish her own new kind of a progressive establishment, her network of funding people in order to build power. If so, it doesn't sound like it's going very well yet because she's still getting pushed out of, forced out of committees. Still getting forced out of committees, and she's still getting this kind of treatment in Politico and other magazines. She doesn't seem to be building that power very well yet, although that does take a long time. But it's interesting to me to see her doing that. And, some progressives have gotten upset and saying, why is she giving money to people who are not for Medicare for all, who are not for the Green New Deal, and who are not necessarily even for raising the minimum wage, although most Democrats are for that. And I'm not her, so I'm not going to presume to say why she's doing it. The worst case scenario is that because of the previous marginalizing she's received, she's trying to get back into her party's good graces by doing this. Better case might be that she's actually trying to build power using money, because that's the system we're in. And she's trying to do that in order to accomplish her goals of Green New Deal, Medicare for all, et cetera, et al. But I thought this was a very interesting article about ways she's trying to move in order to accomplish it. Because one thing I'll point out here before moving on is that I released a previous video where I talked about one thing the AOC could do instead of force the vote. This was during the force the vote time, which was primary more incumbents. And one way you have to try to do that is by having an alternative funding system for doing that. There's a reason why most new members of Congress have a certain political beliefs that they have. The DCCC, which has a lot to do with getting new people elected into Congress for Democrats, as the RNCC is the Republican version. We're talking about Democratic internal politics here. So the reason why is because they oftentimes will both kind of select and pick candidates that they approve of, like they'll pre-approve them, and they'll have a whole donor network of people besides themselves that they say, hey, this person's our guy or gal, funnel your money to them. But they'll also, once you have these freshmen and new politicians elected, they, give them seminars and tell them what positions that they should have about this issue or that. In my story about the DCCC, I talked about how back in 2018, 2019, they had a seminar about how Medicare for all was bad, and actually giving freshmen congressmen, conservative talking points against Medicare for all. So there are establishment mechanisms in place that keep Congress as conservative, even amongst Democrats as it is. And AOC trying to build a system outside of that, I generally would applaud, because you need something like that in order to, try to undo what's being done. And actually, when people come in, they'll have immediately just turn into another, reliable Pelosi vote backbencher. It'll be somebody that'll be independent and will, have and represent their community rather than just being enmeshed into a Democratic establishment as soon as they get there. So that was kind of my take on this whole issue. And I thought it was interesting. Oh, I have a blank space for no reason. Okay, so I have my stuff over to this side, my different slides here. They used to be in front of me. I used to look up all the time from that, but they're over here now. So in other news, there was and I didn't think this was news, but it was a few days ago, we started hearing a whole lot about it, which was that the infrastructure bill was going to be able to use the budget reconciliation system in order to get passed. Now, I thought this was already taken for granted. When they were passing the American Relief Act, I thought it was already said that we had two budget reconciliation bills this year, one that modified the 2021 budget, which has already started, and then a second one that would be for the 2022 budget. But apparently that wasn't officially declared until a few days ago. Excuse me. It wasn't officially declared until a few days ago. And so what that means is, since we've got Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell saying there's no Republican votes for the infrastructure bill, the only chance it has to get through the Senate with the filibuster as it is through budget reconciliation, the way the American Recovery Act, or there's a name for it, but the COVID-19, Biden's COVID-19 bill. The only way to get that passed was through reconciliation. So the same thing was true in this case. Now, however, having said that, we unfortunately have some other news related to that puts a little damper on this. So, and this is why Joe Manchin's face is on the cover of the stream. So I've said before, and I'll say it again here, that Joe Manchin is a pro-business Democrat. He's not just culturally conservative. He's pro-business rather than pro-worker. And this actually puts him out of step with the majority of West Virginians. Now, like most of the country, West Virginians generally vote culturally. And so they're culturally conservative. They vote for Donald Trump. And just like many southern states, they're going to vote for cultural conservative reasons. They're going to tend to vote for Republicans every time. But things like Medicare for all, and especially the minimum wage, and even something like Green New Deal poll fairly well in West Virginia. So does reforming the filibuster when they ask about that in polls. It's not a state that's not pro-worker. There are tons of blue-collar workers in West Virginia. But unfortunately, Joe Manchin, they're both named Joe. Joe Manchin does not represent them. He represents conservative and corporate interests. And that's becoming clear now, because although he was saying previously that he would consider moving forward with the revising the filibuster or reforming the filibuster to make it a talking filibuster, which I said a few weeks ago would essentially make it not the filibuster anymore, because with modern stuff, it's hard to run out the clock in the Senate anymore because of modern travel and conveniences. But now he's saying that first he came out and said, this is all over the past week, just the past week. First, he came out and said that he was against Biden's moderate corporate tax increase, which Biden was going to use to pay for the infrastructure work, or most of it, because the infrastructure bill was $2 to $3 trillion. But one thing I didn't point out last week was that was $2 to $3 trillion over 10 years. So for any given year, it's only going to be several $100 billion. It isn't a ton of money, which is why a lot of progressives and people that wanted, Green New Deal and those type of big infrastructure programs want it to be bigger, because it isn't nowhere near the size of the COVID relief bill. It's actually quite modest once you take it over time. Anyway, so first, Manchin, who, theoretically a conservative, don't you want to, pay for the money you spend? Well, he says, no, I don't want to pay for it. Not at least not this way. So I'm against the moderate tax hike for corporations, which people pointed out at the time would, like the minimum wage, would probably affect some companies that he owns. Then he came out and said he's actually against potentially using reconciliation in order to get around Republicans, even though Mitch McConnell came out as their leader and said, you have no votes. Manchin's out here talking about bipartisanship. It's like as if he's pretending like he's gaslighting. He's pretending like the Republicans aren't explicitly, publicly saying, we will not vote for anything that you put up. And so he's saying, well, we need bipartisanship. I don't want to go around them again for any more bills. So he says that, and then the kicker, he doesn't favor reforming the filibuster, even though he talked about potentially doing that, 2 weeks ago. Now he's saying no. And the cynic inside me says, well, he doesn't like the bills he's seeing coming up. He doesn't like minimum wage bill, even though that's not reconciliation. Schumer wanted to put it in the next reconciliation bill. And so Manchin could potentially be trying to stop that. He doesn't want to do this corporate tax hike, because honestly, taxes is one of the main things you do with reconciliation bills. It's modified. That's what Republicans use them for, is usually lowering taxes. So that's definitely something the parliamentarian would let you do, is increase taxes with them. So he doesn't want to do that. And he probably doesn't really want to spend. He said he wants to be for infrastructure. But if you're for it and you know the Republicans aren't for it, then why would you say you want Republicans on board? To me, it strikes me as he's going to become the status quo senator, the person that stands in the way of really anything getting done, which is where he's placing himself by being against reforming the filibuster. Because without reform, this bill, COVID-19 bill, is the only bill we get this year, and we maybe get one bill next year. And only if it's something that Manchin's okay with, because he will use the idea of bipartisanship and requiring it to submarine anything. So I think kind of his true colors are coming out a bit more, because he seemed like he was more willing to play ball, but now it's actually seeming more like he's not. So that's a little bit of kind of rain on our parade as far as infrastructure, which even at $2 to $3 trillion was still a good bill worth passing. Although I was going to want progressives to try to get minimum wage in there and force that in there, because if not, then it's not going to happen. But okay, so that's a lot of the main news here. Oh, you know what? I did this in the wrong order. I'm gonna have to jump around a little bit. The next thing I want to talk about, the last major kind of news story of the week, is Georgia's new voter limiting, what the Democrats are labeling new Jim Crow law, which is, of course, that giant bill that Georgia passed that in many different ways, it's like 15 different ways, tries to restrict and lower the amount of people that actually vote in Georgia. Now, they do it under the guise of trying to address issues with voting. But the problem is there was no, basis. There was no evidence of problems that needed to be fixed that they were fixing. And I might do a whole different video just on that bill, because there's so much to it. I mean, I could easily do 10 minutes on it, scripted, which is more efficient than me kind of talking offhand. But of course, one of the big highlights was making a felon. I think it was a felony to hand out water or food to people online, which in the big districts in Georgia, just to remind you, are where they have those huge multi-hour lines that people are standing in trying to vote. Of course, in the very rural areas that trend more conservative, you don't have those lines because your population isn't nearly as dense. It's in the larger areas where there aren't enough polling places. Now, of course, another thing the bill does is limit the amount of days to vote, early. It limits those boxes that you can put ballot boxes, ballot drop boxes. All these things are I think also maybe the drive-throughs. That might be a different state. Honestly, there are all these other states doing stuff too. It's hard to keep track of all of it. But they're doing all these methods to limit the opportunity for an individual to vote. I mean, and remember, Georgia is basically a 50-50 state. I mean, it's true purple. It's whoever turns out wins. It's not a blue state or a red state. To me, Florida, for example, is now a red state. If there's a lot of turnout, red's going to win. In other states, like maybe, let's say Michigan, to me, it's a blue state. Even though it can go red, if there's a lot of turnout, it's probably going to be blue. Georgia is really a state where there are enough people on either side based on 1 or 2 percentage points of turnout to make the difference. And because of that, something like this, which may only reduce the percentage of voting, 1 or 2%, could keep it red for another decade or turn it blue if it doesn't work the way they want it to. So here's the thing. So that's kind of what's happening. The controversy is coming in now because Democrats are rightfully taking this opportunity for, it's kind of a slam dunk issue, saying we're for democracy, we're for people voting. So these new, and Jim Crow was a lot more than just voting rights. Jim Crow included, no interracial marriage and all kind of other stuff. But one of the legacies of Jim Crow was preventing African Americans from voting. And so they have become these new Jim Crow voting laws. But some people are now taking issue with this and saying that Democrats aren't being honest because it's not going to have nearly the effect that Jim Crow had in the 20th century on voting. And that's true, but I think that it's pretty clear that Georgia, if you look at their bill, is throwing the kitchen sink legally at the issue. They're doing everything they can within the law, short of actually having like a paper bag test at the doorways to the polls to limit the number of African Americans and minorities in general and young people that can vote. I mean, they're going after several different demographics, but in this case, specifically for African Americans, I don't know if it made it into the final bill, but I remember there was something in there about not letting people vote on Sundays. And Souls to the Polls, if you don't know, was this system where African Americans would, after church, get together and go to a polling place near an election to go vote. It was a way of boosting African American turnout. And under that new Georgia bill, I believe you can't do that anymore because there's no voting on Sunday. And for that, there's no reason given, as near as I can tell. It's just, we don't have time for that, or it's not efficient, or some BS. But this is as close as you can get to 20th century Jim Crow voting laws without actually running afoul of, say, the 14th Amendment or all kind of modern civil rights legislation, federal civil rights legislation. So in the other aspects of the Voter Rights Act of 1965 that still exist. So I think it's perfectly fair. And I think a lot of these commentators doing this are trying to virtue signal to Republican news outlets or conservative news outlets. Some are Republican, some are more just conservative news outlets, that, hey, bring me on your show. I'll actually give you some talking points against Democrats, even though I'm progressive. So I'm not a big fan of that, but that's kind of what's going on there. And lastly on this, before I move on, one thing that's kind of sad to me is that there's all this news now of corporations bemoaning these voting rights laws and saying things like, why are the voters, why do these corporations saying, why are you passing these bills to keep people from voting? We're not in favor of it. We stand with, people being able to vote, blah, blah, blah. And the people talking about boycotting corporations based in Georgia, like Coca-Cola, like Delta Airlines, and doing so because to kind of help them pressure their candidates, because they give money to politicians in Georgia. And to me, it's a sad state of affairs that we now have to try to boycott or beg our corporate overlords to then go and try to get our people who should be our representatives to do stuff for us. This is, when Lawrence Lessig talked about displaced dependency. Those Republicans in the state house in Georgia are dependent on the money from the corporations like Delta and Coca-Cola in order to run their campaigns to get elected. But they should be directly, if it wasn't for things like gerrymandering and other sorts of, and big money in politics, maybe they'd actually be responsive to the people of their state who are in favor of these laws, even conservatives for the most part. I mean, you can convince them and tell them, oh, this is what your party tells you to think, and they may go along with it. But in principle, most people believe in democracy and want people to vote and be involved in their governance. So this idea of having to go to corporations to beg them to convince our politicians to do stuff for us is bass backwards, as you might say. So I think that's a sad commentary on the way things are going right now. Now, related to this issue is when this kind of first started, talk of the boycotts in Georgia first kind of started, the idea of perhaps boycotting Coca-Cola or Delta before they came out and said we're against these laws. Stacey Abrams actually wrote an op-ed in USA Today. Now, in that op-ed, she kind of said, hey, hold on a minute. Maybe don't do a boycott yet. And the reason she gave, the most tangible reason she gave is boycotts are difficult. They take a long time, and they're very painful for the people that do them. These are all true. However, she didn't make a particularly convincing case as to why we didn't need to still try. But it seems like, because pretty quickly after this, Coca-Cola, Delta, and some other corporations are coming out and saying, okay, we're against this law, you shouldn't do it. It's pretty clear that it seemed to me like she maybe knew or was talking to them behind the scenes, or some people were, and she was aware, hey, look, don't rush into this, you may not need to. And, because she has a lot of kind of connections to corporations. She raises a lot of money through corporations for her outreach and her generally good and valuable outreach to get more people to vote, especially in Georgia in particular. And I think maybe through those guidelines, she knew more than she was saying, and she was just trying to publicly, hey, calm down, maybe to help convince. How Martin Luther King used to go to politicians, the president, and he would say, hey, you can deal with me or you can deal with Malcolm. It was almost like Stacey was coming out and saying, wait a minute, and then she goes to them and says, see, look, they're out there. I can hold them off, but you all need to start coming out. So I need to make a difference here so that it doesn't hurt your pockets. And that seemed like maybe what was going on in the background. Because one thing about corporations generally like right now is the status quo. And if things got worse, and if, voting suppression happened, you could see the brand of Republicans get hurt even more in a state like Georgia, which right now, as I said, is 50-50. Well, it could see a lot of blowback and see a lot of defections because, people are very party loyal right now. There's a lot of tribalism in our politics. But at the end of the day, I think the large majority of people believe in democracy and enfranchising people that especially have done nothing wrong. There's no valid reason for them not to vote. Making it harder for them to vote doesn't poll very well. And you could see them potentially losing the state house in Georgia. And, right now, Georgia actually treats those corporations pretty nicely. And they probably don't want that to change. And so why would you kind of go through and do that kind of stuff? Why would you? So they may be trying to convince those politicians, hey, wait a minute, you're going too far. We all got it pretty good right now. Let's keep it going how it is. So I thought that's kind of my take on what was going on there, is that Stacey Abrams was reaching out kind of on their behalf because in the background, she's talking to them and trying to convince them to do what they did, which has a value. And I'm not a hugest fan of Stacey Abrams, but I do think there's a value in having this type of pro-democracy emissary going out and working with corporations, trying to get them to support reasonable, pretty popular Democratic policy where they otherwise might just stand quiet. All right. So that's all kind of the news for this week. I have a few more things I want to go through. What we got here? Okay. So I've talked about this almost every week, but I'm involved in a grassroots organization called Move to Amend. We have a bill, HJR 48, the We the People Act, that states that corporations aren't persons eligible for quote constitutional protections they're statutory entities and subject to statutory law and can't go to the Supreme Court and say, we're protected by the 14th Amendment and therefore we're protected by this other clause in the Constitution of this one. He said, no, your statutory entities created by law and governed by law, and that money is in speech, so that we, the people, and our vote and our blood, sweat, and tears can be the thing that makes people succeed in politics or fail, not boatloads of cash. So we've introduced this bill into Congress several times. It's been HJR 48, I think 2 or 3 times. I think this is the 4th time now. It's been actually HJR 48. And we like that because it keeps the number the same. It's easier for people to remember. And we're trying to build, a movement. And to do that, you want to change as little as possible in terms of the name of the bill, the number, all that kind of stuff. And so it was reintroduced by our lead sponsor, Pramila Jayapal. The big nice news about this is that previously we've introduced it. It's usually only been a handful of co-sponsors, like initial co-sponsors, people that are signed on to the bill on day one, right? This time we got 51 people, 51 Congress members to sign on to the bill from jump. Now, as I told you earlier in the stream, Medicare for all is 128 and it still can't get a vote. So we got a long way to go. But it's still a nice sign that our efforts and our grassroots activism is having an effect. And we're getting a lot of recurring co-sponsors, and we're getting better at, as an organization, at getting those sponsors to come in sooner. And we're hoping to get to many more. I think we got the 74 last time. We're looking to beat that this time. Excuse me. Thank you. So we got 74 co-sponsors last time. We're looking to beat that this time around. So I'm pretty hopeful we'll be able to do that. Now, amending the Constitution is a long-term process both. But, this is something that would fundamentally change kind of the legal framework of a lot of, election-related law as well as corporate law. Like a lot of that's affected a lot by the prominent status that corporations have as given to them by the Supreme Court over the past 130, 40 odd years. Undoing that and putting them back in their place as engines of our economy, but subservient to duly passed law by our society would be a huge gain, as well as just directly saying money isn't speech and shall be regulated. Because there are a lot of states that want to do more aggressive campaign finance reform, but are struck down or knocked down by the Supreme Court. And this would give them more flexibility to do what they want to do, to try to make their, elections, more representative of the people. So yeah, it's a big project, it's a long-term one, but I think it would be a fundamental shift that's worth having a generational, movement to accomplish. All right. Let's see here. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, I think this is the last thing this week. Oh, I might do one more thing. So, yes. So the George Floyd trial. So the George Floyd, well, I should say the Derek Michael Chauvin trial, because he's the one on trial, not George Floyd. But the trial related to the murder of George, the accused murder of George Floyd, has been going on for about a week. And I've mostly not been watching very much of it. I kind of see pieces of it every day. It's running on the news all the time. But what I see is what I expected to see, which is that it's from a pure evidentiary standpoint, a slam dunk. We have video of him laying on his neck. We've got the coroner, the one that the state, hires, not some independent one even, but the one that was the initial person tasked with determining cause of death, saying the cause of death was lack of oxygen. And it seems to me that the only way that, you don't get at least third-degree murder for former Officer Chauvin would be what we call jury nullification. And what jury nullification is, it's when a juror is essentially says, you know what, I understand what the law is, what the instructions by the judge are, but I don't care. I'm going to just do what I think is right. And in this case, I don't think it's right for him to be convicted. I believe that it was, fentanyl did it because he's a drug addict, and we're not going to put a cop in jail over a dead drug addict, or the crowd was scaring them and it's really the crowd's fault. That's what those storylines, those suggestions by the defense attorney are for. They're to create an alternative narrative in the mind of one of the jurors that will convince them that, despite the fact that I'm pretty sure they're going to direct those jurors correctly on how to determine third and second degree murder, and they're going to have plenty of evidence to base a guilty verdict on, trying to get one of those, I assume it's 12, the plus the alternative, but one of the jurors that decides to say, I understand the rules are, and logically and rationally, I should convict, but I'm not going to because I think it was something else. And in my head, in the narrative in my mind, the story in my mind, he's not responsible, so I won't hold him responsible, even though there's the evidence that proves that he was, and even though I've been directed by the court to use that evidence to convict him. That's jury nullification, and I think that's the only way he doesn't go to prison. And even in jury nullification, you get a mistrial, because they can't find a verdict. I'd almost bet money that, I'm not a betting person, but I almost bet money you don't get 12 non-guilties. But you only need one to get a hung jury. That's a mistrial, and then you got to run this all over again. I think they will, because the Attorney General is the former. Oh, what is his name? I can't remember his name now. The former congressman from Minnesota is now this, but I think I think he'll try at least a few more times, or at least one more time. But still, that's I think the defense's only angle is a hung jury and a mistrial. So we'll see if that happens. But it seems like that's what they're angling for, based on the way from what I've seen, way they're running the case, and just generally based on the evidence that seems to exist. All right. So one of my regular viewers is a citizen of Oklahoma, and he asked me a few weeks back, if you talk a bit more about Oklahoma, I'd appreciate it. Now, one thing I've been wanting to do is kind of start looking at politicians in general and doing profiles of different politicians and what they do and where they're from and what have you. And so what I decided to do was look up one of Oklahoma's senators and see what kind of story, or what kind of, how should I put it, to see what his backstory was, see where he kind of generally stood on a bunch of issues. So the two senators from Oklahoma are James Inhofe, who he's been around for a while, and he's pretty hardcore Republican, not as interesting to look into. But there's another one who's he hasn't even been in the Senate for a full term. He finished off Tom Coburn's last term in the Senate, and Tom Coburn resigned. So there was a term to finish, probably like a special election. He finished that term, or he was appointed, finished that term, and then he's been elected for his first full term as an Oklahoma senator, and that's James Lankford. Now, he got a BS, and he then attended seminary after that. And after seminary, which is kind of where you go theoretically to become a pastor, or minister, or a priest, it's like a religious postal education. After that, he worked at the Baptist General Convention of Oklahoma for a very long time, like 7 or 8 years. I should pull up his profile. Hold on. I can just do that. I can just pull up his profile. So, So yes, he was a congressperson first, Oklahoma's 5th congressional district, and from 2011 to 2015. Now, so what happened is his education. Where's the education? I want to do education first. Okay, married with 2 kids. Okay, we know about that. Okay. Where's his education? I saw his education somewhere here. What was his BS? BS in engineering. Oh, here it is. Okay, so he got a bachelor in science, specializing in speech and history at U Texas at Austin, and then he got a master's degree in divinity from the Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I briefly was a substitute teacher at Pflugerville High School. But pretty soon he started working at the Baptist General Convention of Oklahoma for about a decade. He was a program director at Falls Creek, which is a Christian camp, the largest one in the United States. So he's essentially plucked out of a very religious kind of parochial background and thrust into national campaign elections. And so he's that until 2005. By 2010, he's running for the House of Representatives and winning. He serves there for about 5 years. And then he serves in the, And so Coburn retired with 2 years left in his term. And Lankford won the election. So it was a special election for those last 2 years in Coburn's term. And then he won again after those 2 years. He won this first full term, which comes up again, I believe, in 2022. Let's see. No, 20. What? Hold on. 6 years, yeah. So 2016. And he runs again in 2022. So just from that, it looks like he was kind of plucked out of a religious, kind of a career path that was essentially, being involved in the church and performing administrative duties for various churches, to now going into politics. So pretty expectedly, his politics are very conservative. He has an A rating from NRA. He's taken pledges not to raise taxes. One of the most disappointing things is he said that he doesn't believe in climate change science. He calls it a myth, which is unfortunate. He seems to be in the anti-science, as I like to call the anti-science caucus. He wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act. He wants to codify into law. It's not clear by constitutional amendment. I think you'd have to do it by constitutional amendment. He want to codify life as federally protected life as starting at conception. So he is very, 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 very conservative. No surprises here. He's not a candidate that strikes me as one that is particularly kind of independent. He seems to be he opposes same-sex marriage. He is, and he doesn't even want to move on to green energy. He's perfectly fine with sticking with fossil fuels. So this is not a long segment. I think he is on a scale of like 1 to 10, as a Republican, from like slightly red to dark red, he's a 9 or a 10. He's essentially what I expect Jim Inhofe is as well, which is disappointing. I mean, this guy's only like 8 years older than me. And for someone who has a BS and a master's degree to not believe in climate change science, I mean, even if you're not sure we can do anything about it, to actually not even really believe that there's a problem is essentially just ignoring information. It's like pretending gravity doesn't exist or pretending that there's such thing as condensation or something. This is just someone that is not serious. He's not a serious actor when it comes to kind of considering issues that should be kind of beyond partisanship. This is not something that's difficult. It's not something difficult to believe at this point. Everybody's seen the hockey stick at this point. If you believe that, you're choosing to deny science. And that's why it's kind of climate change denial. To me, it's science denial. You can deny what effect we can and can't have on it and various things like that. Denying that it exists means to deny the measurement of global climate temperatures in the upper atmosphere that's been going on for decades. And I don't see how once somebody's doing that, they're kind of beyond reachable in terms, to me, generally politics, because it means that they are letting they're letting information in their agenda. They are serving a political agenda rather than following what their intellect even tells them. So when you want to go to someone who maybe doesn't agree with you in general in politics, be they conservative or liberal, you might go to them and say, okay, you may disagree on this, but can we agree on this? But you have to try to appeal to the intellect. But if someone's willing to segment their intellect that way and pretend like something that's clearly true isn't, there's not much you can do about that. Unless they're being disingenuous, which he might be. He might believe in it, but just simply finds it politically convenient not to believe it. That's entirely possible. It's not clear from this which way that goes because he's so plainly conservative on just about every other point, both culturally and economically. It's hard to see. It's hard to see what he's going to do. I almost forgot. He was one of those senators that at least before January 6th was going to have objections to the vote, to the count of the electoral votes on January 6th. He was one of those, which, you're talking about the peaceful transfer of power. I mean, best case, it's a political stunt. But once you then, and I can't tell from here if he actually went in and voted against counting them, because first is the voting to object to it, which people have done before. The second level is actually voting to then cast those votes aside. When you do that, you're actually trying to inhibit the peaceful transfer of power. And it's not clear to me he did that. And apparently he later apologized for his role casting doubts on black votes. So he may have kind of stepped back from that precipice. But the fact that he's willing to go that way means his default is pretty strongly conservative. And it's hard to see him being reachable on almost any or major issues today, which is what I'm hoping to see. I'm trying to look at all these politicians on the left and the right and seeing where they really stand on not necessarily everything or their tribalism, but on individual issues. Is there wiggle room, on environment or on race relations or on dealing with the massive, people that, unemployment and economic issues and raising minimum wage, which again, shouldn't be partisan necessarily. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. But it doesn't look like he's one of those. Anyway, I've kind of gone on for a while on this. I don't have anybody in my stream anymore. So unless I see somebody, I'm going to go ahead and call it a day. Went through a lot of stuff a little more quickly than I thought I would. But I appreciate the few people that stopped by. One person was here for quite a while, someone else for about one whole story. That was cool. And this is me just taking an hour to just talk about the news of the week through the lens of this channel. I'll have another video out in a few days, and I'll still continue with that as well. Thanks for watching the 10 Minutes for Democracy stream of April 8th, 2021. Have a good day.